In the winter of 1899, Kansas faced the coldest season in its recorded history. Temperatures fell to a deadly 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Blizzards swept across the plains, swallowing entire homesteads under mountains of snow. But in the town of Hays, nestled along the Kansas Pacific Railway, something far more chilling than the weather was taking place behind the closed doors of the Parker Brothers warehouse. When spring arrived and the snow finally thawed, county investigators discovered a mystery that would haunt the region for generations. Over 300 families had reportedly died during the brutal winter, cut off, frozen, starved. But when officials checked the cemetery records, they found only 47 confirmed burials. The rest had vanished. Whispers began circulating about what the Parker brothers had been burning in their industrial furnace all winter. It wasn't just wood or coal, it was evidence. Before we unravel what really happened during those months of isolation and frost, a warning: this story contains long-buried truths, pulled from forgotten court records and decaying ledgers found in the basement of the old Hays County Courthouse. It's a tale of survival, greed, and the darkest corners of human nature. If you're drawn to true crime stories that straddle the line between legend and documented fact, hit subscribe and drop a comment with your state. Let's see just how far this story reaches. The year began with optimism. Hays, Kansas, a growing railroad town of about 8,000, had endured harsh winters before its residents were resilient and deeply rooted in their Christian faith. Main Street was bustling. General stores, churches, a bank, and several boarding houses served the frontier population. 30 miles west lay what locals called the empty lands, vast stretches of prairie dotted with remote homesteads. These settlers, often living miles from the nearest neighbor, survived by grit and self-reliance. But when illness, injury, or nature took its toll, it was the Parker brothers who came to help. Thomas and Samuel Parker arrived in Hays in 1894. Flush with money and ambition, they purchased a large warehouse on the edge of town and quickly established themselves as the men to call when death visited the prairie. Their business was both morbid and necessary: estate cleaning, burial prep, transport of bodies, and liquidation of assets for a grieving community. They offered convenience cloaked in compassion. Thomas, tall and lean with steel-gray hair, rarely spoke more than he had to his younger brother Samuel, was broader, cheerier, and always quick with a handshake. Though many later recalled that his smile never quite reached his eyes. They were known for discretion. When a family perished from flu or starvation, the Parkers would retrieve the bodies, clean the homestead, and make the property market ready. They operated 2 wagons, a small staff of laborers, and, crucially, one of the few industrial furnaces in the county. Officially, it was used to incinerate unsalvageable items. Unofficially, no one asked too many questions. Then came the winter of 1899. Snow began falling in early November. By Christmas, the railroad was choked with drifts. Supply lines failed. Homesteads became unreachable. People died. Sometimes entire families huddled together in frozen silence. Desperation gripped the region, but while most struggled, the Parker brothers thrived. They were among the few still making regular trips into the countryside. Locals watched as their wagons returned, often heavy with cargo bound straight for the warehouse. Neighbors assumed they were doing God's work. After all, someone had to collect the dead, someone had to clean up the mess. When the snow melted and survivors emerged from their frozen solitude, the true scale of the winter's devastation began to surface. A flood of estate claims and death notices came into the courthouse, but as clerks attempted to reconcile records, they noticed something disturbing. Dozens of families had no graves, in some cases entire households. 4, 6, even 10 people were declared dead by neighbors, but there were no coffins, no headstones, no church services. It wasn't just a clerical error. The Hays County Sheriff launched a quiet investigation. What he found was worse than anyone imagined. The Parker brothers had been filing false claims of death. In some instances, they had forged family names to seize property. In others, they had intercepted supply wagons meant for isolated farms and reported the recipients deceased without ever setting foot on their land. If the families were already dead, they took everything. If not, the implication was far darker. One worker arrested after trying to pawn off a woman's wedding ring finally broke. He told the sheriff that the warehouse furnace had never stopped burning that winter. When asked what had been fed into it, he simply replied, whatever was left. The Parker brothers were arrested in the spring of 1900, but before they could be tried, the warehouse mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground. Both men escaped custody during the chaos. Their fates remain unknown today. The town of Hays rarely speaks of the winter of 1899. Some claim the brothers died penniless in a Mexican border town. Others insist they boarded a train under assumed names and vanished into the east, but the county death records remain, as does the chilling gap between the number of dead and the number of buried. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the Parker brothers saw opportunity in tragedy, and they built an empire of ashes. What no one realized, at least not at first, was that the Parker brothers had been quietly perfecting their macabre business model for years, learning how to extract maximum profit from death and disaster. The brutal winter of 1899 would give them their greatest opportunity, yet the first warning came on November 18th when temperatures in Hays, Kansas dropped 30 degrees overnight. Sarah Henderson, who ran the town's telegraph office, noted in her diary that she'd never seen frost form so fast on the windows. By dawn, the town square was buried under 18 inches of snow, and the wind howled with such force that people had to shout to be heard outside. Days later, the railroad suspended service indefinitely. Supply wagons from the east stopped arriving. Isolated homesteads already miles apart became completely cut off, but the Parker brothers were ready. Their warehouse was fully stocked with coal, canned goods, and winter clothing. They had converted their furnace to burn multiple types of fuel, and they owned a reinforced horse-drawn sled capable of traveling through the deep snow. In a town suddenly gripped by desperation, they became unlikely lifelines as December wore on. Families began showing up at the Parker warehouse in search of firewood, food, or simply warmth. Thomas and Samuel greeted them kindly, offering hot tea, dry clothes, and sympathetic conversation to outsiders. The brothers seemed generous heroes in the making, but those who interacted closely with them began to notice something odd. Mary Kellerman, the town's informal record keeper, later testified that the brothers visited her multiple times that December, asking increasingly specific questions about land ownership, inheritance procedures, and the legal steps for transferring property after a death. They claimed they were preparing for the inevitable estate work they'd be called upon to handle once the snow cleared. At the time, Mary found their forethought admirable. Only later would she understand the real purpose behind their questions. The brothers began making regular excursions to distant homesteads, often bringing supplies and firewood. Their visits were portrayed as neighborly gestures, but something wasn't right. According to survivor accounts found years later, families they visited frequently vanished. Not long after, the Kowalski family, who lived 12 miles north of Hays, was visited by the Parkers on December 14th. 3 days later, neighbors found their cabin empty, with the fire out and food still on the table. The Parkers claimed they had helped the family relocate to Missouri to stay with relatives. No such relatives were ever located. These stories were not isolated. As Christmas approached and temperatures plunged to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the town's population noticeably dwindled. Some families had fled east, but others simply disappeared. The Parker brothers' warehouse became a hub of constant activity. Their furnace never stopped burning. Thick black smoke belched from the chimney, and townspeople began to notice a strange, lingering odor, something sickly sweet that clung to their coats and wouldn't wash away. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town physician, tried to investigate. He approached the warehouse several times, but each time was turned away by the brothers, who explained they were burning contaminated goods from homes where illness had claimed lives. Given the sheer number of dead that winter, Dr. Hartwell didn't press the issue, though he made a note in his journal: "The smell is unlike anything I have encountered in my medical experience. It is not disease I smell, it is something else entirely." By the turn of the century, the transformation of Hays was surreal. Once a thriving frontier town of 8,000, it now felt eerily hollow. Fewer than 2,000 remained. Streets were empty, entire blocks stood abandoned, and yet the Parker brothers remained active, busier than ever. They claimed they were processing estates, salvaging belongings, preparing homes for resettlement. But to those still paying attention, something didn't add up. Property transfers began happening with unusual speed. Land that had been in a family for generations was now being signed over within weeks of the owner's supposed death. Items from missing families, furniture, tools, jewelry, turned up for sale in the Parker warehouse, often before official notices of death had even been filed. Most troubling of all, the brothers always seemed to know who would vanish next, as if they were anticipating, if not orchestrating, disappearances. One surviving resident, Eliza Burnham, later recalled seeing Samuel Parker hauling a covered sled across the frozen fields at dawn. She watched from her attic window. The sled was unusually heavy behind him. The snow was stained red. No one believed her at the time. When spring arrived and the snow melted, the truth began to surface, but only in fragments. Families who had allegedly fled were never heard from again. Others were confirmed dead, but no graves could be found. The official death toll stood at over 300, yet fewer than 50 bodies were ever recovered. The Parker brothers had explanations for everything: disease, desertion, poor record-keeping. They portrayed themselves as overworked public servants cleaning up a tragic mess. But some people never accepted the story. Years later, when courthouse files were unearthed from a flooded basement, investigators began to piece together what really happened during that frozen season. The documents, property deeds, forged signatures, and witness testimonies revealed a chilling truth: the Parker brothers had not just profited from the winter of 1899, they had weaponized it. The first person to publicly raise concerns about the Parker brothers was Janet Thornfield, a widowed innkeeper who had lived in Hays, Kansas for over 2 decades. She ran a modest boarding house near the center of town and took pride in knowing every family within a 50-mile radius. As the winter of 1899 wore on and people began to disappear, Janet began keeping detailed notes of the deaths and disappearances being reported, particularly those involving the Parker brothers. Her handwritten records, discovered during a renovation of her former boarding house in 1962, offer a chilling picture of systematic deception. According to her notes, Thomas and Samuel Parker reported handling the estates of 43 different families during the months of December and January alone. That number was statistically impossible, even given the deadly weather conditions. What troubled Janet most was that many of these families had appeared healthy and well-stocked before the cold set in. Take the Brennan family. They had stopped by Janet's boarding house on December 20th. Cheerful and well-fed Mrs. Brennan had even bought candles and flowers, saying she looked forward to a quiet, cozy Christmas. But less than a week later, the Parkers reported the entire family had frozen to death in their cabin. When Janet asked if she could attend their funeral, she was told it was impossible. The cold had supposedly left the bodies in such a state that a viewing was out of the question. The family, the brothers claimed, had already been buried in a simple private service. Similar explanations followed the deaths of the Williamson family, the Crosses, and many others. The Parkers were always polite, professional, and conveniently efficient at liquidating the estates. Shortly after each tragedy, Janet's suspicions grew, and on the evening of January 15, 1900, she saw something she would never forget. As she passed the Parker warehouse during a late walk, she heard voices from inside. Curious, she moved closer and peeked through a gap in the wooden siding. Inside, she saw a family, a man, woman, and 2 children standing near the furnace. They looked frightened. Thomas Parker stood in front of them, speaking in a low, urgent voice. The woman was crying. One of the children asked softly, "When can we go home?" Janet stood in the cold for nearly an hour waiting, but no one emerged. Instead, she heard the furnace doors open and shut several times. Then came the sounds of heavy dragging. When she dared look again, the family was gone, and the brothers were calmly feeding materials into the roaring furnace. The next morning, she made quiet inquiries. Her description matched the Hendricks family, who had supposedly died 2 days earlier. When Janet expressed confusion, she was gently corrected. The brothers explained that grief could confuse the senses. Perhaps she had simply imagined it, they said with kind eyes and reassuring voices. But Janet knew what she'd seen. She began observing the Parkers more closely, noting the frequency of their trips, the pace of their estate cleanouts, and the speed with which new property was sold or claimed. What she found was unsettling, a level of precision and efficiency that went beyond coincidence. The brothers operated with the discipline of men who had rehearsed their plan many times. Through later survivor testimony and court documents, a terrifying picture emerged of the Parker brothers' true operation. They had built a system. They started by identifying vulnerable families. Those who lived far from town, had few relatives, or owned property worth seizing. They then made contact under the guise of offering help, delivering fuel, food, and other essentials. Their generosity earned trust, and once that trust was in place, the family became more and more dependent on the Parkers. Behind the scenes, the brothers had learned the intricacies of property law, inheritance rights, and county filing procedures. They knew how to transfer titles, how to declare deaths without formal identification, and how to exploit the breakdown of law and communication brought on by the storm. They weren't just opportunists, they were architects of a scheme built on isolation, desperation, and complete community trust. When winter cut off communication and buried the prairies in snow, the Parkers turned their legitimate estate business into a cold and calculated machine for acquiring land valuables and eliminating those who stood in their way. The Parker brothers were not merely estate managers, they were master manipulators of systems, people, and records. Over time, they had learned how to forge documents, alter county records, and navigate inheritance laws with chilling efficiency. They cultivated relationships with key officials in the Hays County administration, giving them early access to property disputes and probate filings. But their most terrifying innovation was how they eliminated evidence and people without a trace. When they targeted a family, they used pretexts rooted in helpfulness, offering legal assistance, supplies, or news of distant relatives. Once inside the warehouse, families were overpowered. The Parkers' furnace, retrofitted to burn at extreme temperatures, ensured that bodies and any identifiable belongings were reduced to ash. To outsiders, it all appeared legitimate. The Parker brothers were estate cleaners. Personal items coming in and going out of the warehouse raised no eyebrows. The smell blamed on burning moldy linens or animal carcasses from abandoned homes. The furnace's round-the-clock operation, just part of their cleanup services. It was a system so clever, so horrifyingly efficient, that even the town doctor was kept out. Dr. Edmund Hartwell Hayes, physician during the winter of 1899-1900, later wrote in his journal, discovered in 1978, that he was never once called to examine the remains of the Families the Parkers claimed to find each time he was told the bodies were too decomposed or diseased for a man normally. Responsible for determining cause of death, it was unprecedented. He found it deeply suspicious. The brothers also perfected the liquidation of stolen property. Survivors later testified that the warehouse had designated sections valuables to sell, personal items to burn, and furniture to strip down and resell. Anything traceable was destroyed. The rest was inventoried and passed off as salvage. More disturbingly, the brothers left behind written justifications in letters found among Thomas Parker's belongings. He described their actions as mercy work, claiming they saved families from slow, agonizing death. Samuel's diary, discovered decades later, echoed these sentiments. He genuinely believed they were sparing people from starvation and suffering. Whether this was a rationalization or a coping mechanism, no one can say for sure. By mid-January 1900, the Parker operation had reached its peak. The temperature hadn't risen above 20 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks. Haze was frozen in place, roads impassable, railroads shut down. Communications severed with no outside contact. Oversight disappeared. The courthouse often sat empty. Even when property was transferred, there was no one to verify the legitimacy. The Parkers took full advantage. They began targeting the wealthiest and most isolated families, those with livestock, land, and stocked supplies. They maintained a master list of every homestead in the region, complete with notes on value and vulnerability. Witnesses later confirmed that they prioritized homes based on potential profit. They even refined their forgeries, producing land transfers and wills in mere hours. Documents that would normally require weeks of processing. From early January to early February, they claimed to have processed over 60 estates. The number defied logic, but with the town paralyzed by snow and fear, few dared question it. Their warehouse operated constantly. The furnace never went cold. Workers came and went, some knowingly complicit. Others likely misled. In exchange for food, heat, or protection, they helped sort items, clean out cabins, and haul materials. These laborers became essential to the brothers' operation, and later their undoing. One such worker, Elias Granger, would eventually come forward in his sworn testimony. Elias described a warehouse full of personal effects, children's toys, wedding rings, clothes, still carrying the scent of home. He said the brothers kept meticulous records, names, addresses, lists of assets. Some names had check marks next to them, others had lines through them, and most chilling of all, Elias confirmed what many had feared: the furnace never once stopped. Frank Collar would later testify that had been hired by the Parker brothers to help move salvage materials from their warehouse to the furnace. At first he believed he was handling items from abandoned homes, clothing, broken furniture, and possibly contaminated bedding, but he began to notice that many of the items were in excellent condition. Some bore names, inscriptions, or family marks, things no one would have left behind unless forced. Even more unsettling, Frank observed that access to certain rooms in the warehouse was strictly controlled. Workers were forbidden from entering specific areas, and on certain days everyone was ordered to leave the premises entirely. The Parkers claimed these measures were necessary to handle sensitive documents or dispose of hazardous items, but later Frank realized those were likely the times bodies were being incinerated. Secrecy matched the brothers' efficiency. They crafted detailed cover stories for each disappearance. They sent letters from fictional relatives, created fake change-of address notices, and even mailed periodic updates from families who were supposedly doing well in other states. For months, no one thought to question it, but everything began to unravel because of a toy horse. On February 14, 1900, a young girl named Emma Schultz found a small hand-carved wooden horse half buried in the snow near the Parker warehouse. It bore the initials PB. Peter Brennan. He had been just 6 years old when his family was reported to have frozen to death in December. Emma brought the toy to her mother, who immediately recognized it. She had seen Peter clutching the horse on his last known visit to town. It was his favorite possession. The discovery raised an immediate red flag. Peter would never have parted with that toy voluntarily. Why would it be found outside so close to the warehouse? Mrs. Schultz took the toy to Janet Thornfield, the widow, who had long harbored suspicions about the Parker brothers. Together they began digging deeper, comparing notes, timelines, and rumors. What they found disturbed them: inconsistencies in estate transfers, missing funerals, and an impossible number of natural deaths. They wanted to alert the authorities, but that route was blocked. The sheriff, Tom Brennan, unrelated to the Brennans who died, was overwhelmed and had been depending on the Parker brothers for reports. The judge was snowed in and communication with the state was spotty at best, so Janet and Mrs. Schultz formed their own coalition of townspeople. They approached Dr. Hartwell, who had privately questioned why had never been called to examine any of the deceased. They brought in Mary Kellerman, the county records clerk, who had grown uneasy with how frequently the Parkers inquired about inheritance law. Slowly, a small circle of investigators began to form, meeting in secret, compiling records, and comparing stories. Each of them brought a vital piece of the puzzle. Dr. Hartwell reviewed death reports and found that the causes were often vague or medically inconsistent. Mary Kellerman traced land titles and discovered unusually fast property transfers sometimes processed within a single day. Janet contributed her meticulous logs tracking the brothers' warehouse schedule, and Mrs. Schultz shared her deep knowledge of local families, noting which ones had seemingly vanished overnight. Together they began building a time-linear map of absences, forged documents, sudden inheritances, and silent funerals. They noticed patterns. Families who were last seen healthy and well-stocked were later declared dead from exposure. Their homes, possessions, and lands were almost immediately reclaimed by the Parker brothers, who wasted no time liquidating assets. One disturbing realization followed another. The letters supposedly sent from relocated families all bore similar handwriting. Estate inventories were inconsistent. Items remembered by neighbors and friends were never accounted for, and of the dozens of reported deaths, not one body had been publicly viewed or medically confirmed. By late February, the Circle had become convinced that the Parker brothers were orchestrating a massive cover-up, perhaps even murder. The pieces fit too well: a warehouse sealed from scrutiny, a furnace burning day and night, and a trail of missing families whose names were quietly erased from records. And it had all started with a child's wooden horse. Throughout the bitter winter of 1900, the furnace at the Parker brothers' warehouse burned without pause. Neighbors spoke of acrid chemical odors wafting from its chimneys, scents that clung to the snow like smoke on wool. Yet even more disturbing was the pattern of vanishing families, remote homesteads, whose inhabitants seemed to disappear without a trace after visits from the brothers. The Parkers, Thomas and Samuel, were known for their charity. During hard times, they brought supplies, firewood, and medicine to households that might otherwise be forgotten in the vast frozen expanse. But now that access, the trust they'd built, was being viewed in a chilling new light. Dr. Elias Hartwell and schoolteacher Janet Thornfield had quietly been gathering evidence alongside a few concerned townspeople. They had recorded the disappearances, interviewed neighbors, noted the frequency of visits by the Parkers prior to each vanishing, and paid particular attention to the disturbing intensity with which the furnace operated day and night. The conclusions they were beginning to reach were unthinkable, so monstrous they hesitated even to speak them aloud. By mid-February, the group debated whether to continue their clandestine investigation or risk immediate action. Waiting for spring would mean waiting for thawed roads and the arrival of state authorities, but by then how many more families might vanish? The decision was made for them when word reached Janet that the Parkers planned to visit the Kowalski family, one of the last isolated homesteads still holding out through the winter. The Kowalski's parents, Anton and Marta, and their 3 children hadn't been seen in town since before the holidays. That evening, February 22nd, Dr. Hartwell and Janet set out by sled, keeping to the tree line and shadowing the Parker brothers as they headed northwest through the snow-covered woods. From a hilltop overlooking the homestead, they watched as the brothers arrived just after sunset. They brought crates of supplies and were met warmly by the Kowalskis, who had clearly endured weeks of harsh conditions. The scene appeared benign, even touching, until midnight, when things changed. The entire family, bundled in coats and clutching satchels, was seen departing with the Parkers instead of heading toward town. However, the brothers directed their sled back toward their warehouse near the edge of haze. Dr. Hartwell and Janet followed at a distance, confusion giving way to dread. Why take the family to the warehouse rather than the doctor's office or a safe house? Upon arrival, the brothers ushered the Kowalskis inside and locked the doors behind them. The furnace glowed so hot it cast an eerie red light on the snow. Hartwell and Janet waited and waited, but by dawn not a single member of the Kowalski family had emerged. With no more doubts, the two returned to Hayes and summoned the rest of their group. They knew what they had seen and knew that waiting any longer could mean more death. On the morning of February 23rd, the investigators marched to the warehouse to confront the Parker brothers face to face. Thomas Parker met them at the door, composed as ever, his voice calm. He claimed the Kowalski family had been suffering from frostbite and hunger. He and his brother had delivered them safely to extended relatives in Junction City overnight. He said every concern raised was met with an answer: the odors, chemical agents for cleaning the furnace necessary. In winter, the disappearances, coincidences, miscommunications, people moving on it might have been enough to plant doubt. Had it not been for the stains Dr. Hartwell, trained in medicine, spotted faint but distinct bloodstains on Thomas Parker's sleeves. When questioned, Thomas claimed they were from butchering livestock, yet Hartwell knew better. The texture, the spray pattern, it was human blood. Janet Thornfield demanded entry into the warehouse. She insisted on seeing proof the Kowalskis had ever left the building. Thomas refused. He cited sensitive materials, vague biohazards, and claimed it was no place for civilians. His denial only confirmed their worst suspicions. Realizing they could go no further without official backing, the group turned to Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, a pragmatic man. Brennan had until then dismissed the rumors as baseless fear, but now presented with a journal of evidence, first-hand witness accounts, and Hartwell's testimony about the blood. He changed his mind. Brennan agreed. To organize an official search, no warrant would be needed. If they found probable cause on the premises, the group returned to the warehouse under Brennan's authority, prepared for the truth, whatever it might be. February 25, 1900, Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, accompanied by Dr. Elias Hartwell and 3 armed volunteers, forced entry into the Parker Brothers warehouse just after dawn. The bitter wind howled outside, but inside the building what they discovered would shake the town of Hayes, and eventually the state of Kansas to its core. The site would soon become the focus of court testimony, forensic examination, and decades of historical inquiry. Nothing had prepared them for what they found. The warehouse was vast and methodically organized, almost industrial in its structure. The main floor resembled a storage facility or antique dealer's showroom, with hundreds of personal items carefully displayed and labeled. Clothing, furniture, tools, and kitchenware belongings that once filled the homes of missing families were sorted by category and tagged with catalog numbers. Dr. Hartwell immediately noted how unsettlingly meticulous it all was. This wasn't chouse, it was a system in a back office. The group uncovered boxes of handwritten records. Here the brothers had kept extensive files, property maps, lists of family members, economic data, letters, some forged, others intercepted, and detailed notes on land deeds and estate transfers. Each folder outlined the vulnerabilities of individual families, medical conditions, livestock counts, family heirlooms, estimated property value. It was not simply murder, it was acquisition by design. What disturbed them most were the items that no one would ever have given up willingly: wedding bands, children's toys, crucifixes, lockets with miniature portraits. These were not abandoned trinkets but tokens of life cut short. They were catalogued as if they were museum specimens, with annotations noting their origin and resale potential. All signs pointed to an operation far more deliberate and premeditated than anyone had feared, but it was the furnace room that confirmed the investigators' worst nightmares. The furnace, modified with reinforced grates and bellows, was engineered to burn hotter than standard coal furnace, shot enough to destroy all traces of organic matter around the chamber. Investigators found piles of ash, charred fabric, buttons, teeth, and bone fragments. Dr. Hartwell, trembling, knelt to collect samples. His training left little room for doubt. These were human remains, fragments of multiple individuals, some large, some clearly from children. Hartwell would later testify that the remains likely represented dozens, if not over 100 separate bodies, consumed in flames and reduced to ash beneath the snow-covered warehouse floor. In a locked room nearby they found undeniable proof of the Kowalski family's fate. The room held children's toys, women's scarves, a man's boots, items Janet Thornfield had seen just days prior at their homestead. They were freshly sorted, their labels barely dry. There was no doubt the family had been murdered within the last 72 hours. Among the most chilling discoveries was a leather-bound journal authored by Samuel Parker. In calm, deliberate prose it chronicled the evolution of their operation. He wrote of efficiency, of minimizing evidence, and of the psychological toll of what he called their mercy work. The entries revealed how the brothers initially acted under the pretense of helping families who were terminally ill, starving, or frozen beyond recovery, but over time their criteria expanded. Profit soon overtook pity. When confronted, the Parker brothers denied everything they claimed. They had merely helped with estates and relocated struggling families. But the weight of physical evidence combined with eyewitness testimony left little room for doubt. Thomas Parker eventually broke in exchange for a promise that his younger brother Samuel would be spared the death penalty. He offered a partial confession. What he revealed stunned even the most hardened investigators. According to Thomas, the brothers had methodically eliminated 47 families during the brutal winter of 1899-1900, nearly 200 people. They began by targeting households barely clinging to life, offering them relief or false hope, then escorting them to the warehouse. There the victims were killed, typically through suffocation or blunt force to avoid blood evidence, and their bodies incinerated. Personal belongings were catalogued, valuables retained, and identities erased through falsified letters and estate paperwork. Their system grew bolder. They lured families with lies about newfound relatives or offered assistance managing supposed inheritances. The killings became routine. Samuel later confessed that over time they no longer saw faces, only property values and ledgers. They justified it all as easing suffering, even as they preyed upon the healthy and strong. The trial held later that spring in Topeka became one of the most notorious in Kansas history. Public outrage surged as the contents of the warehouse were brought into evidence: scorched teeth, scorched dolls, inventory ledgers, even pieces of the modified furnace itself. Survivors, relatives, and townspeople filled the courtroom daily. The Parker brothers were found guilty of mass murder, conspiracy, fraud, and desecration. Thomas was executed by hanging. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison, where he died 10 years later, never showing remorse. The case remained a haunting chapter in the region's history, a grim reminder of how human desperation and greed could be masked by civility. how evil could take root in snow-covered silence and be mistaken for a time as kindness. The Parker brothers' case trial, aftermath, and legacy. The trial of Thomas and Elijah Parker revealed the full extent of their crimes, meticulously organized, terrifying in scale, and nearly unimaginable in brutality. Dozens of witnesses came forward to give testimony, and the brothers' own confessions confirmed the investigators' worst fears. The court proceedings exposed not just a string of murders, but a calculated system of deception and exploitation, hidden under a veil of respectability. Both men were convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. However, the legal process was far from simple. The remote nature of Hays, Kansas, the extreme winter of 1899-1900, and the destruction of crucial evidence in the Parker furnace created serious challenges for prosecutors. Jurisdictional questions and unreliable records made it difficult to prove individual murders in many cases, though the broader scope of their actions was undeniable. The revelation of the Parker brothers' crimes sent shockwaves through the region. The systematic way they carried out the killings, targeting isolated families using forged documents and manipulating community trust, was unprecedented. The case quickly became national news, filling newspaper columns across the Midwest. Scholars, criminologists, and legal experts studied it for years, drawn by its disturbing mix of psychological complexity and criminal sophistication. Hays was left deeply scarred. Many of its residents had vanished, entire families wiped out. Property records had been altered, homes abandoned or illegally sold long after the brothers were executed. Legal disputes continued as courts tried to determine rightful ownership of lands and assets. The town had to come to terms not only with the human cost, but also with how such horrors could unfold in their midst without detection. The emotional impact on the community was immense. Many struggled with guilt, neighbors who had ignored warning signs, friends who had trusted the Parker brothers, and local leaders who had failed to act sooner. Some refused to speak of the case again, while others sought answers that would never come. Among those most affected was Dr. Hartwell, who had played a critical role in exposing the Parkers. His journal entries from the period suggest a man shaken to his core, haunted by what he had seen. Though he continued practicing medicine in Hays, those close to him said he was never the same. Janet Thornfield, the boarding house owner who first voiced suspicion, became a local hero. Her quiet persistence and detailed observations were instrumental in bringing the case to light. Still, she bore a heavy emotional burden, often wondering if earlier action might have saved lives. She remained in Hays until her death in 1934, keeping meticulous records of town affairs and watching carefully for any signs of danger. Returning the Parker case had wider implications for law enforcement and community structures. It revealed how easily social trust could be exploited under extreme conditions, and how emergencies like the brutal winter of 1899 could allow predators to operate unchecked. The case became a reference point in policing and criminology, studied as an example of how charm and religious fronting could disguise monstrous intent. Despite the trial and years of study, many questions remain unanswered. The exact number of victims is still unknown. While Thomas Parker confessed to killing 47 families, incomplete records and destroyed evidence suggest the true toll may have been higher. Several families disappeared during that winter, and some were never accounted for. Investigators also struggled to trace the brothers' criminal history prior to their arrival in Hays. There were rumors of similar disappearances in towns they'd previously passed through, but no direct evidence was ever found whether the winter of 1899-1900 triggered their spree or simply gave them the opportunity to act. Remains uncertain. The psychological dimensions of the case continue to fascinate experts. How could two men live among their neighbors, attend church, and present themselves as charitable citizens, while systematically murdering dozens? Their use of religious language to justify their actions suggests a chilling capacity for self-deception and manipulation. It also raised difficult questions about the nature of evil, and how it can wear an ordinary face. The Parker brothers were executed on October 15, 1900 at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. Their deaths brought an end to one of the most horrifying chapters in American criminal history, but the legacy of their crimes lingered for decades, etched into the town of Hays and the minds of all who lived through that dark winter. Even now, the case stands as a haunting reminder of how deeply evil can hide in plain sight and how even close-knit communities can be blind to it. The Parker brothers' case remains one of the most chilling and extensively documented examples of systematic murder in American criminal history. Court transcripts, surviving evidence, and witness testimonies provide a hauntingly complete portrait of how two men exploited isolation, desperation, and trust to commit crimes of shocking brutality. The story not only exposed the brothers' horrific acts but also revealed how quickly normal social structures can erode under pressure. Operating out of a warehouse in Hays, Kansas. During the brutal winters of the late 1890s, Thomas and Samuel Parker targeted isolated families, offering help and warmth during the freezing months. Instead, they carried out what appeared to be a calculated and evolving series of murders. By gaining the trust of vulnerable settlers and controlling key resources like fuel and food, the brothers slowly ensnared their victims, eliminating them in secret and assuming control of their possessions, though executed for their crimes. In 1900, the true extent of the Parker brothers' atrocities wasn't fully understood until a year later. In March 1901, construction workers renovating the basement of the old Methodist church in Hays uncovered a stash of personal items. Hidden beneath the floorboards, jewelry, photographs, children's toys, and religious artifacts all matched descriptions of families who had vanished under the brothers' care. Among these items was a small leather-bound ledger that would change the course of the investigation. Written in a cryptic code that took months to decipher, the ledger revealed the brothers' activities dating back to 1897. The translated entries showed that Thomas and Samuel had already killed at least 15 families over 2 winters before their mass killings in 1899. Using these early murders to refine their methods, the ledger described in chilling detail how they disposed of bodies completely using fire, chemicals, and natural decay in frozen ground, how they forged documents to seize land and belongings, and how they manipulated community perception. Entries also reflected their divergent mindsets. Thomas wrote philosophical justifications claiming they were weeding out the weak, while Samuel focused on logistics, inventory, and profit margins. Perhaps most disturbing were the brothers' experiments with different methods of murder. They initially used agricultural poisons but later preferred suffocation and blunt force trauma, citing them as quieter and harder to detect. These revelations forced authorities to reopen the investigation. Estimates of total victims rose dramatically, with some experts believing the brothers may have killed over 300 people, making it one of the largest serial killing cases in U.S. history. New witnesses came forward, further illuminating the depth of the Parker brothers' deception. One of the most crucial testimonies came from Margaret Kowalski, the only surviving member of a family believed lost to exposure. Margaret had been away visiting relatives when the massacre occurred. Upon her return in spring 1900, she found her entire family listed as dead, with the official cause cited as illness and exposure. Margaret revealed that the brothers had been grooming her family for months, visiting frequently. In late 1899, they supplied the family with heating fuel, later found to be contaminated and inefficient, keeping them cold and dependent. Simultaneously, they spread rumors that the Kowalskis carried a contagious illness, isolating them from potential help with Margaret. A way they struck. Her testimony aligned disturbingly well with entries from the ledger, which confirmed the Parker brothers intentionally isolated, manipulated, and murdered families under the guise of generosity and aid. Their operation functioned like a grim business-efficient patient and hidden in plain sight. Today, the site of the Parker brothers' warehouse is marked by a modest memorial. There are no ruins left, just a plaque honoring the victims and a chilling reminder of the evil that once lived among a trusting community. Criminologists, legal scholars, and historians continue to study the case not only for its scale, but for what it reveals about human behavior during times of crisis. The courage of those who exposed the truth, Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, and the volunteers who risked everything to investigate, serves as a lasting symbol of moral clarity. Their determination to uncover the truth, even in the face of horror, reminds us that communities can resist evil when they choose to act together. The Parker case stands as a stark warning that monsters do not always arrive as strangers, but sometimes as neighbors offering help, and that vigilance, even in the coldest seasons of human history, remains our best defense. Margaret Kowalski's testimony revealed even darker layers to the Parker brothers' crimes. According to her, Thomas and Samuel had been systematically poisoning isolated families with small doses of arsenic sourced from agricultural supplies. The poison weakened their victims over time, making them vulnerable to cold disease and ultimately deaths that could easily be explained as tragic but natural. Once the families were incapacitated, the brothers would offer assistance, gradually luring them into the warehouse under the guise of shelter and aid. There, they were eliminated. Another key witness was Henry Kellerman, brother of victim Mary Kellerman. Henry had briefly worked for the Parker brothers during the winter of 1899, believing he was helping with estate clearing. What he observed unsettled him at the time, but in hindsight it was horrifying. He recalled how the brothers handled victims' belongings with methodical detachment. Personal items were sorted into piles, valuables were kept, sentimental objects often destroyed, photographs and legal documents were of particular interest to them. They studied them closely before burning them in the furnace. Most chilling were the brothers' conversations. Henry remembered how Thomas casually referred to victims not by name, but by property value. They spoke of their operations like businessmen reviewing quarterly profits. Thomas often praised their efficiency, expressing pride in how entire families could be erased without raising suspicion. Henry also assisted with what he was told were bundles of contaminated bedding. He now believes those bundles held human remains. The brothers took care to ensure nothing identifiable survived after incineration. They ground any remaining bone fragments and mixed them with ash before disposal. The full revelation of the Parker brothers' crimes sent shockwaves through Hayes. The town, once a symbol of frontier resilience, now faced a collective crisis of faith. People questioned how such horrors could go undetected in such a tightly knit community. That the brothers had murdered families for years before their final spree in 1899 prompted soul-searching. Had signs been missed? Were neighbors too trusting? In response, churches held prayer services and grief meetings. Reverend William Hartwell, brother to Dr. Hartwell and pastor at the Methodist Church, delivered a now famous series of sermons grappling with the nature of evil, preserved in church archives. These sermons offered spiritual guidance to a community reeling from betrayal. Hartwell urged renewed vigilance and moral accountability in daily life. Economically, the crimes left deep scars. The Parker brothers had fraudulently acquired land, livestock, tools, and entire household's possessions. Untangling these claims proved legally complex. Survivors and rightful heirs entered lengthy court battles to reclaim stolen property. Some never succeeded. The false ownership documents carefully forged by the brothers had become embedded in local land records, muddying the historical and financial truth for years beyond Hayes. The case had major implications across the American frontier. The Parker brothers demonstrated how isolated communities could be exploited by methodical predators. Their manipulation of trust, dependence, and social goodwill was a lesson too devastating to ignore. In response, neighboring towns and eventually state governments began implementing reforms. Authorities introduced new estate and population tracking protocols. The Parker protocols, as they came to be known, required mandatory medical examinations for all deaths in rural areas, multiple witness confirmations, and detailed documentation for all property transfers. These protocols spread across the Midwest and remained part of rural governance for decades. The case also attracted the attention of early criminal psychologists. Dr. Hamilton Craig, a criminal alienist from the University of Kansas, conducted interviews with witnesses and examined the brothers' writings. His findings, published in 1904, were among the first comprehensive profiles of systematic murderers in American criminal history. Dr. Craig concluded that the Parker brothers displayed classic psychopathic traits. Long before the term gained widespread use, they showed no empathy, no remorse. Victims were objects to the means to profit, not people. They were masters of manipulation, capable of maintaining a respectable public image while committing horrific acts behind closed doors. Their crimes were not crimes of passion, but of planning and cold intent. What stood out most to Dr. Craig was their adaptability. The brothers evolved their techniques season by season, refining their poisoning methods, improving body disposal, and fine-tuning how they presented themselves to the community. It suggested not only a high degree of intelligence but also a disturbing level of strategic foresight. The legacy of the Parker brothers case lingers today, not just in the memorials or in textbooks, but in how it reshaped the thinking around rural crime, community responsibility, and psychological profiling. It is a sobering reminder of how evil can thrive in the shadows of ordinary life and of the importance of those who choose to expose it. Many survivors of the Parker brothers' crimes struggled with trauma and guilt for decades. The horror they had witnessed, and in some cases narrowly escaped, left lasting scars. In time, the community of Hayes, Kansas began to build new traditions and institutions to help process that trauma and honor those who had perished. A memorial park was established on the very site of the Parker brothers' warehouse. It features solemn monuments, the names of known victims, and educational exhibits emphasizing the importance of community vigilance. The park became a place not only of remembrance but of reflection, a sacred space where generations could confront the horrors of the past and reaffirm their commitment to preventing such evil from ever taking root again. Despite extensive investigations, prosecutions, and decades of research, many aspects of the case remain shrouded in mystery. The full number of victims may never be known. The brothers' journals were incomplete, and much of the physical evidence had been destroyed, some deliberately, some by time and fire. While the official count reached over 400 confirmed victims, some estimates suggest the true number could be higher, potentially making the Parker case the deadliest serial killing spree in recorded history. The origins of the brothers' criminal behavior remain a source of ongoing debate. Authorities were never able to confirm whether the Parker brothers had committed similar crimes before arriving in Kansas, or if their murderous enterprise began as a response to the unique vulnerabilities of isolated frontier life. Hints of earlier wrongdoing emerged, stories of disappearances in other towns, whispered suspicions. but no definitive links were ever proven. Psychologists have long studied the case to understand the mechanisms that enabled such systematic cruelty. What remains most chilling is how the brothers maintained a flawless facade of respectability. They were known as generous, helpful, even pious men, yet behind closed doors they carried out methodical murder on a scale few could comprehend. Their ability to compartmentalize, lead dual lives raises profound questions about the nature of evil and the psychological factors that allow individuals to commit atrocities while blending seamlessly into the fabric of daily life beyond the individual pathology. The Parker case also forced a reckoning with how communities function. The people of Hayes had welcomed the brothers based on reputation and perceived decency. The trust that held the community together was the very thing exploited to carry out these crimes. The case reminds us that evil often hides in plain sight, and that even in close-knit towns skepticism and vigilance are vital. The winter of 1899 was the coldest on record, but what the Parker brothers unleashed went far beyond the chill of the Kansas plains. It was a coldness of the soul, a frost that settled over the conscience of an entire town. In their furnace they burned more than wood. They burned human lives. They incinerated dignity, trust, and the very idea that safety could be found in neighborly ties. Yet the story does not end with darkness. The courage shown by citizens like Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, and the group of volunteers who risked everything to expose the truth offers hope. Their bravery showed that even in the face of evil, determination and unity can prevail. The investigation that brought the Parker brothers to justice stands as a testament to what a community can achieve when ordinary people act with extraordinary conviction. Even today, more than a century after the executions, the Parker case continues to be studied in the fields of criminal justice psychology and sociology. It is a benchmark in the study of organized murder and community deception. The lessons drawn from it continue to inform how we think about safety, trust, and the thin veil that separates order from chaos. Ultimately, the legacy of the Parker brothers is not about the triumph of evil, but about the strength of those who stood against it. Their crimes were unprecedented in scale, but so too was the resolve of the people who stopped them. The story remains a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. Freedom and safety demand constant vigilance. Every citizen bears the responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Question what seems too good to be true and act when faced with injustice. So as chilling as this tale may be, it's also a story of courage, a reminder that the worst horrors can be exposed and stopped by those brave enough to confront them. And now, over 100 years later, we're still asking, have we truly uncovered the full truth? Were all the victims ever found, or do secrets still lie buried beneath the prairie soil? If this story gave you chills, share it with a fellow mystery lover. Hit the like button to support our content, and subscribe for more true crime and dark history stories, because the truth is often far more terrifying than fiction, and many more tales are still waiting to be uncovered.